In the darkness of history's most horrific chapter, where humanity's capacity for evil knew no bounds, one woman's name became synonymous with unspeakable cruelty. They called her the Witch of Buchenwald, the Beast, the Bitch, titles that barely scratched the surface of the terror she inflicted. Her story would later echo through the twisted mind of another killer, inspiring gruesome acts that shocked America. This is the chilling tale of Ilse Koch, a woman whose descent from ordinary German housewife to one of history's most notorious war criminals reveals the terrifying truth about how evil can flourish in the human heart. Welcome back to Shadows of Scriptures, where we delve deep into the darkest corners of human history. And today we're exploring one of the most disturbing figures to emerge from the Nazi regime. Before we begin, I want to apologize in advance if I mispronounce any German names or locations. The weight of this story demands accuracy, but some pronunciations may not be perfect. If this is your first time here, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. We explore these dark chapters not to glorify them, but to understand and remember, so history never repeats itself. The story of Ilse Koch begins not in darkness, but under the warm skies of Dresden, a city known for its elegant Baroque architecture, lush gardens, and vibrant cultural life. Born on September 22, 1906, Margaret Ilse Kohler was the daughter of Max and Anna Kohler, a modest Protestant couple who lived in a tidy suburb bustling with families, tradespeople, and neighbors of diverse backgrounds. Dresden was a city of contrasts. In neighborhoods near the Kohlers, Jewish families lived as integral parts of the community: shopkeepers, musicians, teachers, and artists. Their children played alongside non-Jewish German children in schoolyards. Synagogues stood beside churches, symbols of a multifaceted heritage. Ilse, like most girls her age, attended elementary school, where lessons included reading, writing, arithmetic, and the teachings of the Protestant faith. She was remembered as a quiet child, obedient and polite, a far cry from the infamous figure she would become. Ilse's childhood was overshadowed by the tremors of change. In 1914, World War I erupted, a cataclysm that would engulf Europe in bloodshed and leave Germany shattered and humiliated. By 1918, the Great War had ended in defeat, and Dresden bore scars like many German cities. The Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh penalties, devastating the economy and national pride. Germany spiraled into inflation and unemployment, and resentment festered in every household. This bleak new reality saw the rise of radical ideas. Ultranationalist rhetoric gained footholds by scapegoating those labeled as enemies of the German Volk. Many Germans, struggling to survive, found solace in extreme ideologies blaming Jews for their misfortune. Young Ilse, growing from child to teenager in this volatile climate, absorbed the changing tides. What had once been peaceful coexistence was replaced by suspicion and bigotry, silently shifting the fabric of her childhood city. In her teenage years, Ilse's life unfolded against the backdrop of a society where anti-Semitic propaganda fed fear and hatred. Jewish businesses were boycotted, synagogues vandalized, and social segregation became commonplace. By the early 1930s, the Nazi Party, promising to restore Germany's former glory, gained immense popularity. It churned out endless propaganda portraying Jews as the root of Germany's problems. Ilse, working as a clerk in Dresden, became an ardent supporter. It's hard to reconstruct her exact inner thoughts, but the path she chose suggests she embraced the hateful ideology that promised order in chaos and a return to purity. Jewish neighbors, some who had known her family for generations, suddenly were enemies in the eyes of this new worldview. At 15, Ilse left formal education for vocational training, learning bookkeeping and office clerical skills. These were practical choices for a woman of modest means, yet her ambitions ran deeper. By 1932, she joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party, proudly displaying the swastika, an emblem destined to bring destruction to millions. Society around Ilse mirrored her choices, with increasing persecution of Jews codified into law. The Nuremberg Laws, passed in 1935, stripped German Jews of rights and citizenship. Jewish girls who had once shared schools now watched friends disappear, forced from their neighborhoods, imprisoned, and later deported. Amid rising chaos, Ilse's trajectory changed irrevocably when she met Karl Otto Koch, a visionary within the SS, a paramilitary organization responsible for enforcing Nazi racial policies. Their relationship was founded not just on marriage, but on shared faith in Nazi ideals. Rigorous racial purity tests demanded that Ilse prove Aryan ancestry, excluding any trace of Jewish heritage. This obsessive focus on bloodlines would later underpin the horrors she unleashed. Their wedding in 1936 was held at Sachsenhausen concentration camp, a stark symbol of their union forged not in love alone, but in commitment to a system of ideology and brutality. It was here that Ilse stepped into the machinery of state terror, soon exercising power over thousands of prisoners, many of whom were Jewish men and women torn from their homes. As Ilse married and moved deeper into the Nazi regime's inner workings, the world she grew up in, a world where Jewish neighbors once waved across fences and walked school corridors with her, was being destroyed. Synagogue doors were barred, streets emptied of Jewish life, and thousands were marched to camps like Buchenwald, where Ilse's name would become infamous. Her childhood and youth had been comfortable enough, but it was the choices she made during these turbulent years, the embrace of hatred and cruelty, that cast her forever into history's darkest shadows. In the strained and volatile atmosphere of early Nazi Germany, Ilse Kohler's meeting with Karl Otto Koch was more than chance. It was a convergence of two souls shaped by the same brutal ideology. Karl, a rising star in the SS, was known for his ruthless ambition and unwavering commitment to the Nazi cause. Their relationship was fast-moving but forged under the heavy hand of Nazi racial laws. Ilse was required to prove her racial purity before their marriage was approved, a ritualistic obsession that went beyond politics, striking at the core of the Nazi regime's genocidal logic. Certificates were gathered, family trees scrutinized, and every shred of alleged Aryan blood documented to satisfy Nazi officials. In 1936, Ilse and Karl were married at Sachsenhausen concentration camp. The setting was emblematic, a place built for terror. Now, the backdrop for a union that would change not just their lives, but the lives of thousands who would come under their control. The camp itself was already expanding as a site of imprisonment and torture, primarily for Jews, political opponents, Roma, and other groups deemed undesirable by the Nazis. The very soil seemed soaked in cruelty, and Ilse stepped into this world, not as a bystander, but as an active participant in the machinery of oppression. In mid-1937, Karl was appointed the first commandant of Buchenwald, a new concentration camp near the historic town of Weimar. Ilse followed him, bringing with her the cold determination and ideology that would define her notorious reign. The couple moved into a spacious villa on the edge of the camp, a lavish home that would stand in stark contrast to the suffering of the prisoners below. Here, Ilse hosted parties and received SS officers, her presence a symbol of the dark nexus between brutality and privilege. Their children were born in this villa, innocent lives flourishing in the shadow of genocide. Buchenwald became a sprawling prison holding tens of thousands of prisoners, a significant portion of whom were Jewish men forcibly taken from homes across Europe. These men, fathers, scholars, laborers, and religious leaders, found themselves stripped of identity, reduced to numbers, and brutalized beneath Ilse's shadow. The Jewish prisoners lived under terrifying conditions: overcrowded barracks, starvation rations, and beatings. Many attempted to maintain fragments of culture and faith, gathering clandestinely to pray or share memories of their lives before the war. Ilse's cruelty specifically targeted Jewish inmates. Testimonies recount her indulging in arbitrary and vicious punishments, cursing them as Jewish swine and exacting brutal retribution for any perceived slight. Ilse was often seen mounted on horseback, riding through the camp with a riding crop in hand. Witnesses recall her whip cracking sharply against the worn backs of Jewish prisoners. Her presence inspired terror. She was both overseer and executioner, her laughter intertwining with the cries of the abused. Jewish prisoners whispered among themselves, naming her Die Hex von Buchenwald, the Witch of Buchenwald, a chilling moniker born not merely of hatred but of genuine terror. Her actions went beyond cruelty into the realm of sadism, embodying the regime's genocidal hatred with a merciless personal cruelty. Among the many horrors, Ilse's obsession with the tattoos on Jewish prisoners symbolized her dehumanization of them. These tattoos, forced marks of imprisonment, became objects of fascination for her twisted mind. She would select tattooed men, often Jewish prisoners, ordering them taken away. Survivors attest these men rarely returned. The feared selection process was more than a death sentence. It transformed victims into grotesque trophies. Rumors of lampshades and other items crafted from tattooed skin created an aura of dread. For Jewish prisoners, the tattoo on their arm became a branded sign not just of captivity, but of the monster's curiosity and cruelty. While the Jewish prisoners toiled in harsh conditions, Ilse's life inside the villa was one of excess and power. She entertained SS officials, attending banquets and social functions, all while knowing the screams rising from the labor camp. Her children played within the villa's walls, a brutal reminder of innocence amidst horror. The separation between her domestic life and the suffering outside was stark, highlighting the moral bankruptcy of a regime that raised children in a palace built on the bones of the Jewish victims below. The villa on the hill, later known simply as Villa Koch, was an island of luxury overlooking one of the darkest places on earth. Ilse Koch, the Witch of Buchenwald, lived here amid fine furnishings, chandeliers, and a roaring fireplace that would contrast horrifyingly with the cold stone cruelty just below. Inside those walls, Ilse's children grew, innocent and unaware of the screams rising from the camp where thousands of Jewish prisoners were held. Men torn from Jewish communities across Europe, stripped of dignity and marked by the yellow star of shame. Buchenwald housed Jews alongside political prisoners, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others deemed enemies of the Nazi state. Every day, below the villa's panoramic windows, the lives of these Jewish men were calculated in hours and days. Starvation, torture, exhaustion, and medical experimentation quietly claimed tens of thousands. Even as she bathed and dined, Ilse allegedly exulted in this suffering, personally directing cruelty with capriciousness and cruelty. One survivor testified that the mere glance of a Jewish man towards her could provoke a beating so severe it would leave him broken. She delighted in tormenting those who had been musicians, teachers, fathers, reduced now to quivering shadows, struggling to survive. Jewish prisoners feared the roll calls where tattooed inmates were singled out for brutal punishments or disappeared forever. Each removal instilled horror and helplessness, every tattoo a sentence. Jewish prisoners often endured roll calls lasting hours in the freezing cold or sweltering heat. Ilse supervised many of these events herself, prolonging them arbitrarily to inflict suffering. Forced labor was brutal, quarrying stone, constructing camp buildings, or working exhausting shifts in factories related to the Nazi war effort. Many Jewish men bent under the heavy burden of survival, their bodies weakening daily. Ilse is reported to have coerced her husband to increase punishments, demanding floggings, longer work hours, and even ordering prisoners thrown from cliffs at the camp quarry. She was not just complicit, but a driver of the cruelty surrounding her. Adding to the grotesque spectacle, Ilse had a small zoo built near the camp, proudly housing animals like bears, wolves, and monkeys. To prisoners, this was a grim insult. Humans caged and tortured nearby, while beasts in relative freedom inhabited the same grounds. The zoo symbolized the bizarre world Ilse inhabited, a world that blended sadism with a perverse performance of power. Behind the scenes, Ilse was no mere spectator. Reports spoke of her participating actively in the repression, driving policy decisions, and consenting to atrocities against Jewish prisoners. Her reputation included a disturbing blend of cruelty and sexual depravity. Survivors recounted her violent sexual exploitation of prisoners, many of whom were Jewish men, using violence, threats, and her supreme power to satisfy her desires. Ilse's control was absolute. Jewish prisoners who defied her or even accidentally offended her faced harsh punishments, including extended beatings, starvation, or death. By 1941, the cruelty and corruption surrounding Karl and Ilse Koch began to unravel the protective veil the SS had initially cast over them. While the Nazi regime turned a blind eye to the atrocities committed against Jewish prisoners at Buchenwald, the Koch's misuse of stolen wealth and blatant embezzlement raised serious concerns within Nazi leadership. Karl's command had been marked by not only merciless persecution of Jewish inmates, but also by greed. Precious valuables confiscated from Jewish prisoners, gold, jewelry, money, were supposed to maintain the Nazi war apparatus. Instead, these treasures flowed into the Koch's personal coffers, funding their lavish lifestyle amid a sea of starvation and death. The internal investigation into Karl and Ilse's conduct was initiated by Josias von Waldeck-Pyrmont, the SS police leader for Weimar, after rumors of graft reached Nazi headquarters. In 1941, an SS judge named Konrad Morgan was assigned to probe allegations of corruption and unauthorized executions that shielded stolen goods. Morgan's investigation uncovered evidence of considerable embezzlement by the Koch gang. 200,000 Reichsmarks in stolen property, much of it taken from Jewish prisoners. The judge's inquiry also revealed that Karl had arranged murders to silence witnesses who might reveal the thefts. While the Nazi regime condoned mass murder as policy, this internal crackdown reflected the obsession with party loyalty and financial discipline. The Koches had overstepped even this brutal system's limits. On December 18, 1941, Karl Koch was arrested and stripped of his command at Buchenwald. However, his arrest was not just about justice, but about internal power struggles. SS Chief Heinrich Himmler intervened personally to secure his release, though Koch was never returned to Buchenwald and was instead assigned to command the death camp Majdanek in Poland. In 1943, after further investigations and renewed charges led by Judge Morgan, both Karl and Ilse were arrested again. This time, charges included embezzlement, the unauthorized murder of prisoners, including Jewish inmates, and theft from the camp's treasury. While Karl was convicted by an SS court in December 1944 and sentenced to death, eventually executed at Buchenwald days before liberation, Ilse was acquitted in this SS trial due to insufficient evidence. The contrast between Karl's fate and Ilse's temporary freedom masked deeper truths about her role in cruelty. Despite the apparent acquittal, Ilse did not escape suspicion or notoriety. Post-trial, Ilse Koch moved with her children into a modest flat in Ludwigsburg, away from the looming shadows of Buchenwald. However, justice was not finished with her. On June 30th, 1945, American occupation authorities arrested her in Ludwigsburg after she was identified by a former Jewish inmate of Buchenwald. This arrest marked the beginning of a long legal fight addressing the atrocities she was accused of committing against Jewish prisoners and others during the Nazi regime. Jewish survivors who came forward to testify later described Ilse's cruelty in profound detail, from forced humiliations to orchestrated murders, establishing her as one of the most notorious figures associated with Buchenwald. The fall of the Koches reflected the paradox of a system that permitted genocide, yet punished those who betrayed its strict hierarchy or enriched themselves beyond order. While Ilse avoided immediate punishment, the voices of Jewish survivors ensured that her crimes would not be forgotten. For Jewish prisoners, their suffering and pain were etched not only in the history of the Holocaust, but in the individual cruelties of Ilse Koch's reign. The Dachau trial prosecuted Ilse Koch and other defendants on the charge of participating in a common design to commit war crimes, meaning the prosecution did not have to demonstrate that she personally committed specific acts of violence, but that she materially aided the functioning of the criminal camp system. Testimonies from Jewish survivors were pivotal. They described the brutal realities of forced labor, starvation, beatings, and psychological abuse. Witnesses recounted Ilse's direct involvement in selecting tattooed Jewish prisoners to be singled out for death or singled out for special punishments. Multiple survivors gave harrowing accounts of Ilse's cruelty and personal involvement in acts that degraded and dehumanized her Jewish victims. Ilse's demeanor during the trial was reportedly cold and unrepentant. Lieutenant Colonel William Denson, lead prosecutor, described her as no woman in the usual sense, but a creature from some other tortured world. A statement reflecting both her cruelty and seeming emotional detachment. On August 14, 1947, Ilse Koch was found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to life imprisonment. However, because she was 7 months pregnant at the time, a fourth child from an unknown father, her sentence was later commuted by General Lucius D. Clay to just 4 years. This commutation shocked many survivors and observers, particularly within the Jewish community, who felt justice had been diluted. General Clay maintained that the evidence regarding some of the most sensational allegations, like lampshades made from human skin, was unconvincing, asserting that such items were made from animal skin instead. This assertion baffled and outraged many witnesses whose personal testimonies strongly supported claims of Ilse's direct involvement in horrific acts. In October 1949, after serving approximately 4 years, Ilse Koch was released, only to be immediately rearrested by German authorities. The American military had no jurisdiction over crimes committed against German nationals, so the West German judiciary pursued charges related to torture, incitement to murder, and grievous bodily harm against German citizens imprisoned at Buchenwald, many of whom were Jewish. This legal maneuver underscored the complexity of post-war justice, with overlapping jurisdictions and divided responsibilities impeding straightforward accountability. The trial before the district court at Augsburg began in late 1950 and lasted 7 grueling weeks, with over 200 witnesses called, many Jewish survivors who came forward to testify about Ilse's atrocities. The hearing exposed the depths of the camp's horrors and her cruelty. During the trial, Ilse maintained a defiant stance, famously denying any wrongdoing. She claimed, "I never saw anything at Buchenwald which might have been against humanity. I was too busy raising my 2 children." Yet the flood of survivor stories painted a starkly different reality. Several witnesses testified about traditionally accepted claims that Ilse selected tattooed prisoners who were subsequently killed, and that human skin was used to make lampshades and other items. Despite the persistence of these testimonies, the prosecution dropped the charge related to lampshades after failing to produce definitive physical evidence. Nonetheless, the court found Ilse guilty of incitement to grievous bodily harm, incitement to attempted murder, and incitement to murder, crimes that directly acknowledged her role in encouraging and facilitating violence against Jewish prisoners and others. On January 15, 1951, Ilse Koch was sentenced to life imprisonment and the permanent loss of her civil rights. The court's written statement was particularly scathing, denouncing her as a woman who consciously suppressed every feeling of compassion and gave free rein to ambition, pride, and selfishness. Her stubborn denial of guilt and lack of remorse only fed the court's harsh judgment. An appeal to quash the conviction was dismissed in 1952 by the federal court justice. Throughout the remainder of her life in prison, Ilse pressed petitions for pardon. Every request was denied, notably by the Bavarian Ministry of Justice and the International Human Rights Commission, reflecting the enduring recognition of her crimes and the terrible legacy she embodied. Jewish survivors and their families continued to ensure her infamy was preserved in history, viewing her life sentence as a small but essential measure of justice for the unimaginable suffering inflicted upon them. Following her conviction in the Western German legal system and sentencing to life imprisonment around 1951, Ilse Koch began the final chapter of her life behind bars. Though imprisoned for her complicity in the horrific crimes at Buchenwald, she remained defiant to the very end. Throughout her incarceration, Koch consistently denied responsibility for the atrocities attributed to her. She maintained a public posture of innocence, often portraying herself as simply a mother and bystander rather than the sadistic figure survivors described. Prison officials noted her unrepentant attitude, with some describing her as emotionally detached and ruthlessly manipulative. Letters and legal petitions revealed her repeated attempts to secure a pardon or sentence reduction. These efforts were staunchly opposed by survivor groups and governmental authorities, ensuring she remained incarcerated. The last decades of Ilse Koch's life were spent largely at Aichach Women's Prison in Bavaria, a stark and restrictive environment far removed from the luxury she once enjoyed at Buchenwald's villa. Survivor testimony and prison records indicate that even in confinement, Koch's notoriety followed her. Guards relayed that some inmates feared her or were repelled by her infamous reputation as the Witch of Buchenwald, a moniker that haunted her as much in custody as during the war. Yet, within those cold prison walls, isolated and fading, Koch neither recanted nor expressed meaningful remorse. She lived her days consumed by bitterness and denial, haunted perhaps by the legacy she so brazenly rejected. On the night of September 1st, 1967, after nearly 24 years in prison and facing the permanent stain of her war crimes, Ilse Koch took her own life. She fashioned a noose from bedsheets in her cell and hanged herself, ending a life that had become synonymous with cruelty and evil. She left a brief note addressed to her son Uwe, stating simply, "There is no other way. Death for me is a release." This final act closed a chapter on one of history's most infamous female perpetrators of atrocities. Koch's suicide was met with a mixture of relief, condemnation, and reflection worldwide. Survivors and historians remember her as an enduring symbol of the personal cruelty embedded within the broader horrors of the Holocaust. Despite efforts by her son and some supporters to seek posthumous rehabilitation, the overwhelming historical consensus condemns Ilse Koch for the suffering she inflicted on thousands, primarily Jewish prisoners at Buchenwald. Her life and death remain a stark reminder of how ordinary people can become agents of unimaginable evil. Ilse Koch's name has endured as one of the darkest symbols of cruelty during the Holocaust. Her crimes, particularly those inflicted upon Jewish prisoners at Buchenwald, embody the terrifying intersection of human sadism and systemic genocide. Her story has captured public imagination for decades, both as a warning and a monstrous archetype. The allegations of creating macabre artifacts from human skin, especially those prisoners tattooed with Jewish symbols, resonate as haunting reminders of dehumanization taken to monstrous extremes. Across the Atlantic, decades after the war, a different kind of horror emerged in the rural town of Plainfield, Wisconsin. Ed Gein, known as the Butcher of Plainfield, horrified the world with gruesome murders and the grotesque crafting of items from human remains. Gein's crimes included lampshades, bowls, and belts made from human skin, acts strikingly similar in horror to those attributed to Ilse Koch. Did Ed Gein actually know Ilse Koch or her crimes? There is no definitive evidence that he was directly aware of her or that Koch personally influenced his behavior. Gein never publicly mentioned Koch after his arrest, leaving the connection speculative. However, the media coverage surrounding Koch's highly publicized trial and her reputation as the Witch of Buchenwald was extensive in the United States during the 1940s and 1950s, years leading up to Gein's known crimes. It's plausible that this cultural knowledge indirectly influenced Gein's macabre imagination. Regardless of direct influence, the juxtaposition of these two figures, Koch's Nazi-era atrocities and Gein's American serial murders, illustrates how stories of evil can transcend time and geography, feeding into cultural myths of horror. Ilse Koch's infamy continues to inspire films, books, and academic discussions about evil, humanity, and the nature of cruelty. She remains a symbol not only of the Holocaust and humanity, but also of how personal cruelty can amplify systemic atrocity. The lessons born from her story emphasize the need to confront the darkest aspects of human nature and ensure vigilance against ideologies that dehumanize and destroy. The story of Ilse Koch is a harrowing reminder of the depths to which humanity can fall when hatred and cruelty go unchecked. She was not merely a product of her dark time, but an active participant in the systematic destruction of thousands of Jewish lives. Each one a story cut short, a legacy forever altered by unspeakable evil. Remembering her crimes is not about dwelling on darkness for its own sake, but about honoring the resilience and memory of those she sought to destroy. As shadows of history lengthen, it is vital that we carry the light of remembrance forward. The lessons of the past are not distant echoes, but urgent guides for today, reminding us to stand against hatred in all its forms and to protect the dignity of every human life. If this story has moved you, please take a moment to subscribe to Shadows of Scriptures. By joining our community, you help ensure that these lessons are never forgotten, that the voices of survivors and the memories of victims continue to speak across generations. Share this video with those who value history's truths and the fight against intolerance. Together, we can illuminate even the darkest chapters and inspire a future grounded in compassion and understanding. Thank you for journeying with us into history's shadows. Until next time, may light always strive to overcome darkness.